Good afternoon, ladies and gents, and a very warm welcome back to the virtual Boeing 737 training event. Pedro, it's great to be back.
Yeah, it certainly is. I've been looking forward to this the whole day. So very welcome, everyone, especially if you're new out there and you missed yesterday's. Glad to have you here.
Yeah, it's good. We had a great session yesterday evening where we kind of introduced what we're doing on this virtual training event. And we went through like the full cold dark setup. And we got to a point where we are ready to enter into the world of the flight management computer. And we're going to demystify that for you today. We also had a great Q&A session this afternoon where we had a good hour and a half of going through a deep dive into various systems from IRSs, fuel, electrics. And I went through and answered all of the questions that you guys, some great questions from yesterday's session, from the Facebook groups, there with me live as well. And same today, guys. If you've got any questions, anything you're not sure about, please do ask in the Facebook group. Please put them down. And then tomorrow at 1300 UTC, we'll be doing another Q&A where I'll be going through those questions with you as well. So without further ado, we will jump into the sim down here. So as we said, we've done the full kind of setup. And for those, just to refresh your memory, we finished off down with the rudder and aileron trim. We finished that flow. And now we're going to dive into the world of the FMC.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Something that confuses a lot of people. But yeah, it is actually surprisingly logical once you start working with it.
It is. And we're going to kind of show you that it actually leads you through the setup process. When you understand the way it works, you'll see that it actually guides you through the right steps, because there's a lot of pages in here and you can easily get lost. And Pedro, as you know, when we're training cadets in this, they'll often know where that they can picture the page that they want, but they can't remember the sequence of buttons they need to get there. And
when in doubt, press init ref.
This one, exactly.
When in doubt, press init ref.
Yeah, it's and you'll learn why in a mo. You're going to learn why that's the case, and it's a great way to kind of get back to somewhere sensible. Okay, so if you've registered, you've got the briefing pack for today, which has given you things such as the custom flight plan for the flight that we're going to be flying from London Stansted to Dublin. I've annotated the various parts that you need to know. We're also going to bring that on screen when we need it at various points. And we're then going to go through the other topics with the performance. Now, I'm just going to make sure that the Facebook stream is started properly. So let's just have a little look here. Let's just see. We're just going to make sure that the Facebook does go as it should do. It's not letting me go live, but let's just see. Just bear with us here for a moment, just to make sure that this is all happening as it should do. Okay. Okay, what we'll do, we'll get our admin, we'll see if we can get Navin to have a little look at this to see whether we can get this up and running. And just because for those, we're streaming this onto Mentour now, as well as into the private Facebook group. So we will do our best to get the Facebook group up and running. Sometimes they don't like to play with each other, but we'll see if we can get all this up and running and get it going. And let's just go live now and see if we can get that.
Yeah, so while Ben and Nevin is working on that, we can talk a little bit about how the flight management computer is supposed to work. So the reason that I'm saying that when in doubt, press init ref has to do with the FMC actually knowing or having preferred pages. So depending on where you are in your flight, depending on which phase of the flight you're in, the FMC will assume that you want to do certain things. So, for example, when the IRSs are not properly aligned, as in when they want to be aligned, you press init ref, then it's going to go to the push init phase, right? So it's going to tell you that this is where I think that you should be now, because I need my IRSs to be aligned. Similarly, as you go along and you fill in certain points into or certain data into the flight management computer, it will bring you to the next logical step. So that's why whenever you are in doubt, if you find yourself, I don't know where I should find this place, you press init ref, 8 times out of 10, you will get to the right page. And now it seems like we have got the Facebook stream up and running as well. So, so for you guys who are just joining on Facebook, basically we've just introduced ourselves and said that we are going to continue where we were yesterday, which is now going into the flight management computer and setting that up properly for the flight. So, Ben.
Absolutely. So very warm welcome to everybody signing in via Facebook as well. Now, as we said, we left off last time just with the setup of the aircraft, and we're now going to deep dive into the FMC. And this is the first page really once that we would have seen now since the setup. And what you're going to find here is on the bottom right of the screen, you're generally going to get a prompt that will guide you to the next logical step in the FMC setup process. And that's the route. So what we're going to do now is we're going to press the line select key adjacent to that. And we can now start pumping data from the flight plan into the FMC. And it's going to follow a fairly kind of logical order. So obviously the origin is where we're at, and the code for the airport we're in, if you're not sure, we could get from the flight plan. And if you're referencing your flight plan, it's where number 2 is at the top of page 1. And I'm going to enter that in there now. The destination is Dublin. So we're going to put the code in for that, which is also on the flight plan, Echo India Delta Whiskey. And then we put our flight number. Now, we're Butter Airways today, and the flight today for our inaugural flight is BTR 001. Again, we get that from our flight plan, as you can see, and that's at number 3. So we pop that in the line select key next to that. We can also put the runway in use, which we got from the ATIS yesterday as runway 22. Now, sometimes you might get a company route, which we used to have years and years ago, and we used to have in KLM UK, and it would automatically populate that all of the data in there, but the routes change so regularly, daily, that doesn't really work for what we do. Okay, so you can see, yes, Peter.
Interestingly here, that flight number that you put in is super, super important, right? If you don't put that correctly, and if you put the wrong one in, you're going to be severely chastised by air traffic control, because this is what pops up through ADS-B onto flight radar 24, for example.
Yeah.
So it's super important that you put the correct call sign in here, otherwise people will come after you.
Absolutely. And we do hear it occasionally on the air, don't you? Can you please update your flight plan? And it's something we will be checking later. So there is not really an excuse to have it wrong. So when you're doing this yourself, you'll be following this flow, and then you'll be checking yourself like we're going to be showing you very shortly, just to make sure there's no little mistakes in here. Now, there's 2 different ways we can go now. We can either go to our next page. You can see we're page 1 of 2. If you press next page, we can start entering the route, which is on the page, the next page of the flight plan, page 2. But there's another way, which is possibly a more logical way, which is putting in your departure and arrival as well. Peter, which way do you teach?
So I like to think of this setup as the flight that I'm about to do. For me, it's logical to think, okay, so I'm in the route. What's the first part of my route? Well, it's a departure. It's a standard instrument departure. So I will go to departure arrivals first. I will go to departure, which is the top left button there. And then, as you can see, runway 22 is already selected. But if you reselect that, it will limit the amount of departures to only those available from runway 22. So in the previous one, you had all of the departures from both runways available, like this. There's loads of them. If you're in Dublin or Stansted or Heathrow, you're going to have tens of them. Yeah. But if you select runway 22, you will only get the departures available from that runway.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the page 2 there on your flight plan, which is on screen, you can see that the first point there, where it actually says Utava 1 Romeo. So it's telling us that flight planning department has expected us to fly that. Very often that's going to be the correct one. So if you select Utava 1 Romeo up there, now if you go back to the route page again and go to the next page, you see that it goes to the first flight plan, which now mirrors what you can see there on page 2 on your flight plan. Utava 1 Romeo to Utava. So that makes sense. So if you continue from there on and you just fill in, I think Ben is going to do that for us now, fill in exactly what it says there en route. So Utava via the Quebec 75 airway, and that goes to Bussard. So this is basically using the airway, and then it's going to the intersection of that airway until you can follow the next airway. In this case, that's the Tango 420 to Trent, Tango November Tango, followed by the Upper Lima 28 to Leldo, and then the Mike 145 to Bagso. And if you can see after Bagso, it says something else. It says Bagso 3 Lima. So that's an arrival route. So now I would go, after Bagso, I would go back into departure arrivals, then go to arrivals. And then, from the wind direction and stuff that you've had on your preparation state, you can kind of guess which runway it is. This way it says runway 28 left on the flight plan as well. So I will select ILS 28 left. Again, that will just limit the amount of arrivals to the one that is available for that runway. And it says a bags of 3 Lima. So I will select that. And then comes the transition, right? This is a little bit more tricky because the flight plan will generally not give you the transition, which means that you need to have the plates available for Dublin here in order to figure out which transition it is, unless you know it by heart because you've been there many times. In this case, Ben, which ones would you guess it is?
Yeah, without the chart in front of me, I would initially go for Pisa there, and then worst case we can always refine that a little bit later on. So, so it could be it's a Binu. It might well be a Binu actually. So I'll probably go a Binu on here. We cross check that in a moment. And and this is what you do in real life potentially. If you're going somewhere and you've got a different arrival, you haven't been there for a while, you would potentially just get the chart out and go and have a look at it and see where that takes you. But worst case, give it a guess, and you can always refine it a little bit later on.
Yeah, and this is something that, I mean, doing it this way it's already building your situational awareness, right? You're already thinking in terms of which plates do I need for my briefing later on, even what arrival can I expect, and you're building a picture in your mind about what you're expecting to do during this flight. So it's not so much just mindlessly droning in stuff on your flight management computer as it is you preparing yourself mentally for what you're about to do. And a flight that is as short as a Stansted to Dublin flight, about 45 minutes or so, like you need to be ahead of the game all the time, and this is part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of is building that right from the beginning here. So we've now got that in. We go back to that route. So you've got page 1 of 3. You go to the next page 2 of 3, and you can see now after Bagso, which is where we left it. If you go to the next page, now it's completely filled it in with the arrival. And the clue that you've probably got it right is that there's no what we call a discontinuity. Because if I put an incorrect transition in there, which transitions from the last point of the arrival to the first point of the approach, if it didn't match up, the FMC will go, I don't know what to do after this waypoint. And it puts what we call a discontinuity, and it just breaks the route up. And if that's the case, we then have to go and look into it and go, why is that there? And it's probably because we need to select a different transition. Yeah, most commonly. Now, remember what we said, how the bottom right key here will often lead you to the next waypoint. So what we're going to do now, we've put it in and we're going to activate. We're going to activate that, but we don't fully execute it. It kind of arms it ready for use. And you'll see here that this light will come on as soon as I press that, which means now that the route is now going to be in there, but it's not executed yet. And we won't execute it until we both cross-checked it, which we're going to do a little later. So the next thing we're going to do, we've done the routing, we've done the departure and arrival. And what we're going to do, as Petter said, now there's no prompt anymore. So let's just go to init ref. And that's going to lead us to the most sensible place here. So let's put that. There we go.
System works.
And it works. And lots of box prompts. You remember, we've got 2 types of prompts in the FMC. We've got the dashed or the box prompts. Remember what we said yesterday, the box prompts are mandatory inputs. So the FMC needs something to be put into this field in order to be able to progress. Now we're going to use our flight plan now, which you've got in your briefing packs, to load up the data in the FMC. And we're going to go back now to page 1, as you can see on screen. And we're going to start on the bottom left. Firstly, we've got cost index. Now, if you look at number 9 on your flight plan, on the top right of the flight plan, page 1, you can see there it's got CI17. That's just it's the way the airline kind of prioritizes fuel or time effectively. And the higher the number, the more it prioritizes time and doesn't care about fuel cost. The lower the number, the more it's worrying about fuel costs.
Yeah.
So, but today, Butter Airways has chosen a cost index of 17. Now, the next one up, reserves. If you look down at number 6 towards the bottom of page 1, you'll see there that it says FinRes, which is your final reserve and your alternate fuel. And we would round that up. So it says 2,118 kilograms. And what's the benefit? What alert will we get? What's the purpose of putting this in here?
Yeah, so this will give you an alert when you start to use your alternate fuel. So when let's say that you're going into holding now over Dublin because the weather is poor or whatever.
Yeah.
When you touch that fuel, so when you burn down to that fuel, you're going to get a using reserve fuel message on your FMC CDU. And that's to alert you that, okay, now it's time to either commit to this airport because we know that the weather is improving or that they're clearing away whatever is stopping you from landing, or I now have to divert. Now it's the time. So generally speaking, if you end up in a holding, you tend to sit together with your first officer and like, okay, so the minimum, absolute minimum is 2.2. But let's say we make the decision at 2.4, and you can go in and you can increase this a little bit just to give you 10 minutes of actual thinking through time. Yeah. But when you reach that amount of fuel, you're going to get a warning.
Yeah, and I do exactly the same thing, Peter. If I know there's a likelihood we might be diverting or weather is an issue, I will normally up this so that if we're busy avoiding weather and talking to air traffic, I'm going to get an alert nice and early to start thinking, right, we need to start thinking about going to, to plan B, because this fuel here means you're initiating the diversion at that point in fuel. Yep. It doesn't mean we've got to start thinking about it at that point, because arranging a diversion takes a bit of time. And we don't want to start eating into this unnecessarily. So yeah,
you might have to think about things like using other alternates. Yeah, that we also have in the flight plan. So you might have to increase this to reach an alternate that is further away, because obviously if it's due to weather, the weather might be actually affecting your alternate as well. It shouldn't, because you would have checked that. But there's things like, for example, if you are diverting, you might not be the only one diverting. So if you're in Stansted and you want to divert to Luton, 10 aircraft ahead of you have already done that. The apron is now full and you can't use it anymore. You have to go to East Midlands instead. So all of these kind of things is stuff that you have to start projecting quite early.
You do, and fuel planning is a really interesting topic and quite a big, quite in-depth topic as well. And there's potentially more in the future there for those that are interested, which we'll talk about more in the future. But going back to here now, you see ZFW. That is our zero fuel weight. In other words, the weight of the aircraft with everything on it apart from the fuel. So, all the passengers today, the bags, catering, the crew, and that's calculated by the flight plan. Now, if you look at number 8 on your flight plan, you'll also see a ZFW there, the estimated, and that's a nice even 55,000 kilograms today. So we would just put 55 in there, or 55.0. And what that will now do is when we put that in there, it will add the amount of fuel on board and then give us a gross weight, our total weight of the aircraft. So when I pop that in there, quick maths, 61 tons, 61,000 kilograms with the fuel on board, which makes sense. Then we're going to go.
I just want to say as well to everyone who's asking questions in the chat that we are not going to be answering most of these questions now. We are taking notes of them though, and tomorrow at 13 Zulu, Ben will have another hangout where he will go through all of these questions with you. So just keep them in mind, write them down, and you'll have a chance, providing that you have signed yourself up to the course, you'll have a chance to get an answer then.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're definitely not ignoring them. We'll look at all of the questions. So please do ask the questions, as Petter said. So the next set of box prompts up here are our cruise altitude. And again, that's calculated by the flight planning department. And if you look at number 7 on the flight plan there, you can see that it says 360, flight level 360. That it's flight levels and altitudes are slightly different things. They're very linked, but 360 is 36,000 feet based on a standard pressure setting. And again, altimetry is a deep topic, isn't it?
Yeah, but those who've seen my last video knows what the difference between QNE, QNH, and QFE is. So
there you go check it out.
Otherwise, you go and check it out.
Absolutely. Good. Now, the next ones, we have some optional prompts. So we can see the cruise wind in here. And that's quite a useful one to tell the FMC what the wind at our top of climb is going to be, because what the FMC is going to try and do based on the cost index is try and keep our distance that we reach top of climb the same. And what I mean by that is if you've got a really strong headwind, our climb speed is going to be much, much quicker, so that our ground speed is kind of the same. Similarly, if you've got a big tailwind on the climb, you'll find that your climb speed is a lot slower. But again, that will be giving you a very standard ground speed. Now, if we go to page 5 of the flight plan, you will see that gives you on the top of that page on the left, you'll see it says the airway, Tango 420, which we put in, but underneath that, TOC, top of climb. So it's expecting that's where we're going to reach our cruise of 36,000 feet. And if you look at number 10, the wind there is 172 degrees at 40 knots. So I'm going to pop that in, 172 at 40. So that's going to give the FMC some really valid data. And the little box next to it, +3, that's what we call the temperature deviation. which you might want to pop in the FMC, depending on what your FMC says. Sometimes it says ISA deviation, where we put +3. So in other words, it's 3 degrees warmer than what we would call a standard day. But in this scenario here, it says top of client outside air temperature. Above the +3, it says M54. So that's -54 degrees centigrade. So if you wanted to, you could pop that in there, and that would now, again, give it all the data it needs to calculate an accurate climb performance.
Yeah, if you don't, basically, whenever you're dealing with the FMC, shit in, shit out, right? If you don't put correct stuff into it, or if you don't feed it with enough information, you will not get as accurate of a flight profile. So the more time you spend with actually populating this, both now and later on in flight, the better it's going to be for you.
Yeah, and for that purpose, we're going to cross-check a lot of this later on as well. So we are going to kind of make sure that it's not just me typing this in really quickly and making a few mistakes. Petter's going to cross-check it with me in a moment, and you're going to see how we do that. Now, remember, again, that bottom right key, it prompts us to the next logical step. Now, N1 limit is where it wants to take us. So if we press that, the N1 limit. Now, the N1 is the name given to the speed of the fan at the front of the engine. Any idea what? I don't know why it's called N1. That's a question that I was asked. Any idea, or is it just a name?
If I'm not remembering incorrectly, it has to do with the pressure sensors that used to be sitting at different stations inside of the engine, where the pressure sensor number 1 was just prior to the fan.
Right, makes sense. Yeah, that's the most answer I've heard.
I think that's where it comes from. Obviously, it doesn't have to do with pressure anymore, because it has to do with the percentage of spin on the fan. But I think it has something to do with that.
Okay. But for our kind of intents and purposes, the N1 is the big fan at the front. And this is where we would set in a moment, because we won't necessarily have the data we need to enter this. We put the outside air temperature, which again, we would get from the ATIS. So if we see a slash here, if we want to put data here, you've got to start with the slash. So if it was 17 degrees here, you put the slash 17. And if you have a little look here, when I line selected here, it's going to put the 17 degrees to where this is. And you'll see that the FMC, the auto throttle computer, will calculate a maximum thrust rating based on that temperature. And you probably see it change. So at the moment, it's 98.2% N1 at 15. If I put 17, it goes up to 98.5. And that's because the air is a little bit thinner. It's less dense at 17 degrees than it was at 15. So to get the same kind of flat rated performance, it needs to up the power ever so slightly. We'll come back to this page in a moment once we get our performance data. And then the next prompt is the takeoff. And again, we would leave this at this point. We can't do anything with this until we work out our takeoff performance. Okay. So this now is where probably the dispatcher would come into the flight deck, and they would say, hi guys, yeah, boarding's complete. Here's your load document. And we would check it, sign it. We would give it back to them, and potentially the cabin crew would be there, and they would confirm head counts and where people are seating in the cabin and so on. Once we've got that data, we can now go into our onboard performance tool, which is basically on an iPad. It's Boeing software, and it will enable us to input all the data that we would need in order to calculate our takeoff performance on that particular runway, on this particular day, with all the conditions that we have. Now, as I said, we're not going to go into too deep into takeoff performance today, simply because that's a whole topic on its own and something we can look forward to potentially in the future. But if I just jump back into here, and if we bring up our takeoff performance, as you can see on the screen now, we can now populate that data back into the FMC. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press init ref, and you can see that takes us to where we left off, M1 limit. And now we would both calculate this independently to make sure, because this is vital. This is one of what we call a vital action. Because there's plenty of examples. There's one relatively recently, wasn't there, where they put a wrong intersection in, I think it was. Yeah. If you, like Peter said, if you put the wrong information in, it's going to give you the wrong information out. So there's a real flight safety issue here. So we do really take our time with this, and we really cross-check everything to make sure that what we're getting is correct. And we would populate this with the ATIS. So you can see we've got London Stansted in there. We're using runway 22. The INTX is which intersection. So we can line up on the runway at various points along the runway. And based on where you're parked, you would look at what the most likely intersection would be. Now here in Stansted, we'd probably take the full length of the runway, which is what we would say line up, and that would allow us to line up onto the runway from there. But you could potentially put other shorter sort of line-up elements in there as well.
I tend to always take the one that it could be like the most limiting one, so that if you have the possibility, if there's a blockage at the intended intersection or whatever, within reason, obviously. I would do that.
And I do exactly the same, simply because if you're taxiing out and suddenly air traffic go, oh, are you able, Quebec 1, you're like, oh, I haven't done the takeoff performance for it. So at least if you've done it, at least you know you're able to take that performance. But for this example, we're taking the line up. The runway condition is next. Runway conditions have codes. 6 is dry, 5 is wet, and so on. Today in London, the UK, it's actually a nice day for the first time in a long time. So it's actually a dry runway. The wind, we would cross-check from the ATIS, the outside air temperature, the QNH. And then we go, you see the rating, which is optimum on there, which basically means the calculator can work out what the optimum takeoff thrust setting will be for us. Assumed temperature measured, which is ATM. We'll go more into that in a moment. The flap, it defaults to 5. We've got air conditioning in auto. The anti-ice is off. And we've got improved climb or extended second set. But that's something we'll maybe go deeper into. We can look forward to further on for those that want to continue learning. And that's going to pop out some numbers. So we'll go in here, and you can see, if I just on here, that it gives us some numbers. So it says on the bottom of that page, you can see it says R22K. So what are these numbers, Peter? 26K, 24, 22K. What is that?
So the engine is max rated in this case to 26,000 pounds of thrust.
Yeah.
That's the 26K, which means full. But you can also, in order to save on engine life and maintenance and so on, reduce the available engine thrust. So if you go down to 24K or 22K, you will not have as much thrust available to you. So we use this to what we call derate the takeoff thrust. In essence, we will calculate the minimum safe amount of thrust available or needed in order to make this departure, because that will save on fuel, noise, engine use, everything. So it's cheaper, more environmentally sound, better for everyone involved, but it's still safe. So those of you who are maybe doing ATPL theories, you know that there's a lot of calculations that goes into this. The aircraft must have enough thrust to accelerate to be able to have enough runway left to stop, the accelerate stop distance. You have to have enough to reach a screen height, single engine at a certain distance, and so on. So there's a lot of theory that goes into this. But in here, the only thing you have to worry about is what's the minimum thrust needed in order to do this safely. And the machine has already plopped that out for us.
Does it all for us. Yeah, when you're doing your ATPLs, you've got to work all this out with paper charts and so on. But this, pop it in, great. How we like it. So it says 22K. So we're first of all, you can see with full thrust here, 98.5. As soon as I select 22K, it's going to give us effectively 22,000 pounds of thrust instead of 26. So it comes down to 92.1%. But we can also reduce it further. And you can see there that it says selected temperature, which we call an assume. And you can see we have an option to put the selected temperature up here. And that's where we can kind of, I guess trick is probably the wrong word, but it gets the point across, doesn't it? Where we're kind of telling the computer that we could actually get airborne if the temperature was 47 degrees today and still get airborne safely. Because as we said earlier, the higher the air temperature, the less dense the air, the less efficient the engines are. So it's telling us that actually we could get airborne at 22K at 47 degrees if the air was 47 degrees outside. It's only 17, but if we put 47 degrees in the selected temperature, we're effectively going to get the engines to give an even lower thrust rating so that they perform in the same way as if it was 47 degrees outside, if that makes sense. So that now brings it down to 86.8%. So, Peter, any other sort of explanations on selected temperature or assumed temperature?
I mean, it's a way to fine tune to get, like we said, if the target is to try to get the lowest possible engine thrust output and still stay safe.
Yeah.
The fixed D rate 24, 22 is a rough kind of way of reducing it, and this is how you fine tune so that you get down to the exact number. And it is by like Ben is saying, it's by tricking the engine that it actually has to deal with air that is much hotter than it is, right? So it's giving you the output as if you had 47 degrees of air going through it.
Correct. And you can see we've actually reduced it from its full power actually to something quite a lot lower. So we would cross-check that together. And now, again, we go to our takeoff page, and I can see some great questions coming through. I most certainly will be answering those for tomorrow's live Q&A for you, because there's some really good ones there. But we're going to continue now. We're going to go to our takeoff page. And this is where, again, we read off our OPT. And you can tell on there that it's given us a flat 5 departure. So we would now put flat 5 in here, and it's going to now calculate some speeds. And we're going to cross-check the flight management computer and auto throttle computed speeds with the Boeing software to make sure that they're correct. And we're going to talk about what happens if it doesn't work. So first of all, flat 5, we suddenly get some speeds generated. We would also put in, you can see down there, the C of G of 19.4. That's the center of gravity of the aircraft based on the information that we would have put into this to get these numbers, where people are seated, where the hold baggage is, and so on. So we can put the C of G in there of 19.4 in the C of G here, and that will give us a stab trim, a stabilizer trim setting, which should match what we have here in the OPT, plus or minus 0.25. Now it depends on, the flight sim in here, it might be slightly different, but we'll pop it in. And the Boeing say we should have a trim of 6.0 units. The FMC here says pretty much 5.8. That's within tolerance. And what we would now do, in fact, is we would set that. And it's very rudimentary. It says very accurate 5.79 units of trim. But what we're actually doing is setting it on this very simple looking scale on here. Whereas if you can set it to 0.01 of a unit, I'd be very impressed. But we're going to bring this back now. This is our trim. And what this is going to do is make each takeoff feel the same. So when we pull back on the control column to rotate the aircraft, it's not overly hard to pull back. It's equally not super eager to pitch up. This is going to make sure that the input...
It's a nerd bell, by the way. Every time you hear that, it means that something nerdy is coming up. So as Ben is doing this, normally when we do this in the flight deck, we do the calculation together, we cross-check with each other, and it's the first officer who sets the stab trim. Now, the way you want to do this, if you ever find yourself in a cockpit and you're doing this, is you want to lean over and protect the leg of the captain, right? Put your hand in between the captain's leg and this spinning wheel, because as you can see, it is spinning. And there's more than one time where the captain is actually resting his knee on the just on the outside of this, because you kind of sit. It's an awkward position to sit in. So you kind of rest your knee towards the inside of this trim wheel, and if you just all of a sudden start moving it, that little foldable handle there will come up, and it will just bang into your kneecap. Right? It hurts. It hurts a lot. So if you want to do this, and you want to do it, like if you want a little gold star at the side of your line training folder, then what you do is when you set this, you kind of just put your hand in between. That will remind the captain to remove it, and then you set it. That's nerd bell. That's,
there you go.
The extra.
Yeah. Proper nerd bell territory. And it's certainly, when you get that clump on the knee at 4 o'clock in the morning, it certainly wakes you up. I tell you, my right knee has definitely got more scar tissue than my left. So definitely worth protecting the captain's knee. But there you go. That's my best effort for setting 5.79 units. The FO would set that, as we said. And now we're going to cross-check the weights. The speeds. So you can see on the OPT on the screen, we've got a V1, a VR, and a V2. Now, the V1 says 136. Now, the general rule is as long as our FMC calculated speeds are within plus or minus 1 knot of the Boeing calculated speeds, we can accept them. If it's more than 1 knot, we would take the OPT, the Boeing from the iPad, we would take that data, because that's the master document. So the FO would read out, V1 136, VR 136, V2 139. So 36, 36, 39. We've got 36, 37, 40. That's within 1 knot. So what you can do is we can line select these, and now they become active. And what you will see now is, bear with me, is you have your V1 at the very top of your speed tape.
You might have to, there we go. Yeah, it was never needed to take the flight plan.
Thanks, Nevin. So yeah, just right on the top, because before we selected that, it said no V speeds in yellow, and there have been instances in the past online where crews have forgotten to actually select these speeds in there, and they're curdling down the runway, and there's no V1 displayed or VR displayed on their airspeed tape. Now, V1 VR significance of that, Petter?
Yeah. So V1 is the decision speed. It's the speed at which a decision to either reject or continue the takeoff must have been taken, right? So it's not when you start thinking about it, it's when you decide. So if you have an engine failure, fire, predicted wind shear warning before V1, then you reject the takeoff, and you are calculated. Like I said before, the takeoff performance has been calculated so that you have enough runway available to stop safely, right?
Yeah.
After V1, that's not the case. After V1, it's calculated for you to get airborne, even with an engine failure or any of those things. So before V1, you stop. After V1, you go. With those particular failures, VR is the rotation speed, which can be significantly higher. So if you have a wet or a slippery runway, for example, you can have a V1 that is 15, 20 knots below VR, which means that you call V1, you have an engine failure, and you still have to accelerate for quite a bit. But you still have to do that because the runway is slippery. So if you would try to reject there, you would just go off the runway. So you just continue, no matter how weird that will feel. It's like V1, engine failure, rotate, and off you go. That's going to be the case. And then V2 is the safe engine out climb speed. So that's the speed that you will actually climb with V2 to V2 plus 15, is it?
That's exactly. Yeah, V2 to max of plus 20, and that will get you climbing away depending on when the engine failed. But yeah, it's a good training environment. We sometimes we'll do short runway training, and we'll do it somewhere like Southend, and we'll do engine failures, and it really does focus the mind, because you have an engine failure just after V1, and there's this horrible long gap, as Petter said, between V1 and VR if it's a contaminated runway, and you can see the end of the runway getting closer and closer and closer, and you get the VR and you rotate and you get airborne, and you're literally getting airborne, and you're across the end of the runway at 35 feet, 40 feet. You really are kind of just scraping it airborne, but it's all legal, it's all calculated to be that way. But you only really see these on performance limiting runways. In Stansted, it's 3,000 meters, 3 kilometer long runway. There's loads of space. So they're very similar numbers.
Yeah. And when we have calculated this and we put that into and activated it into the FMC, the first officer goes up and select V2 on the mode control panel as well.
Right.
So you can see that we've forgotten that by the little magenta bug being over V1.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be. So we'll put it up to the V2 selection there.
And a good little gross error check here, just to check that you've got it rough sensibly in the right kind of area, is what I do as a gross error check whenever I do this. And this seems to work well, certainly for flap 5 anyway, is if you subtract 20 from your takeoff weight, your V2 speed should be should put a 1 in front of that for your V2 speed. So 61 minus 20, 41. So I'd expect my V2 to be about 141. It's 140, if that makes sense. And it's a really, really good gross error check, because if I saw 61 tons and I saw my V2 of 125, that would prompt me to go, hang on a minute, have we got something wrong here? And I would go over it again to check. So take 20 off your takeoff weight. So it'd be 41, put a 1 in front of it, and that should be your V2. And you can see it's within a knot accurate.
Does it work on the max as well?
Yeah, and it's not quite the same. It's close, but it's not as close, I've noticed. You might find there's 3 or 4 knots different. It's ballpark, but not quite as precise as on the NG. And different flap settings are slightly different as well. But for the normal flap 5, that's a great little gross error check, and it works time after time. It's really good. Right, so we've now kind of done the performance. We've done the FMC load. We've probably said goodbye to the cabin crew at this point, and they might be they'll be closing up and just starting their safety briefings. And now's a good point for us to start our briefings.
Yeah.
Be in the seats. The distractions hopefully have started to slow down or stop. We might still be in the middle of dispatches coming on, depending on how the turnaround's going. But now we stick to another acronym, which is RIBITS. And this acronym is an important one, and it guides us through our briefing structure. Now, briefings, I'm sure a lot of you are aware, especially if you're watching Petter's videos, they can be a poor briefing, can be the root cause of a badly flown approach, or even worse, some kind of incident. Same for takeoff. So we brief and thoroughly brief everything we do, every takeoff, every approach, even though it might be the millionth time we've taken off of this runway, we still brief it to keep everything fresh in our mind. And we have a standard structure so that the person you're flying with, you may never have flown with them before, will know roughly what to expect, and you're going to add our own bits into it. So it just follows. Now, rivets. The first thing we're going to do is our route check. So in a moment, we'll show you how to do that. We're going to cross-check the route that I've just put in. Within the I is an instrument cross-check. So we're going to cross-check that all of our instruments are in agreement. The B is a briefing, telling you what kind of takeoff we're doing. The E is what we'll do in the event of an emergency. So we're going to brief exactly what we would do in the event of an emergency. The T is we brief out expected taxi routing. And the S is what we call our SID briefing, our standard instrument departure briefing. And we're going to show you the protocol that we use here. And woven through this is something called TEM, Threat and Error Management. It's a big part, Petter, isn't it, of what we do on a day-to-day basis?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's something that's come in quite recently. Actually, It's kind of something that was always in our, we were always thinking about it, but it's had been formalized lately, where we actually talk about threats as part of the briefing. And it has to be threats, obviously, that are current for the day, not generic threats.
No. And when we kind of mean threats, think, what do you mean by threats? Well, threats, things that could present a challenge to us or a potential issue for us on this particular day. So there might be, let's say, work in progress on the taxiways, which means there's a narrower taxiway. The threat, is ground collision, or the error will be ground collision. So when we're talking about that, we highlight that. We're anticipating that this could happen today. And that gets us thinking that way. And by doing that, when we realize that there's a particular threat, we can then do something to mitigate it. We go, okay, so if we're unsure or we're of any doubt that we're too close to the aircraft we're taxiing past, what are we going to do? We're going to stop. We're going to set the parking brake, and we're going to contact air traffic for a follow me. So that now in 3 or 4 minutes, 5-10 minutes time, when we do taxi out, we're ready for it. We've anticipated it. So if the FO goes, hang on a minute, that looks a bit close, I'm just going to do what I said. And we've potentially prevented an event from happening. And there's, an unlimited amount of potential threats, and you might have flown here yesterday and could have a completely different list of threats than we've got today. So, right, without further ado then. So, Petter, are you ready for me to start talking? And we'll start doing a route check?
Absolutely.
Okay, so, we might talk about any main threats, the obvious big picture stuff before we get into a rivets. There's not a lot today. It's a lovely airport. It's a home base. There's not a huge amount to talk about from a threats perspective. We've got a lot of people on the jump seat today, so maybe that might be a distraction. Hundreds, if not thousands of people watching us. And then we're going to go into Petter. So what Petter would do now is, because I put the data into the FMC, there's a potential that I misread the flight plan. Being human, we all make mistakes. So now what we're going to do is Petter is going to read the flight plan in a very structured way, and I'm going to cross-check it in the FMC, and that should avoid any confirmation bias. So to do the route check, we're going to press the route button, and you can do this yourself, okay, when we're doing this single pilot. And go back to the flight plan, and Petter's going to start off, as you can see, with number 1, the OFP. Petter, what's the significance of the OFP there, the OFP 3?
The operational flight plan.
Yeah.
So it's super important that we are looking at the correct flight plan, because sometimes our performance department or our flight planning department sends out a new flight plan, right? So there might be delays, there might be something that we don't know about. So we have to make sure that we have the latest version. So we update before we do this to make sure that it's not OFP 5 now or OFP 15 or something like that.
Yeah, and obviously what we've got here is a paper one, which is what we used to use. But when you're actually flying on the line, this is actually on like your iPad, and it will give you an OFP actually a green or a yellow if it's changed. So yeah, go ahead, Petter. So yeah, you've got OFP 3, I've got OFP 3.
Okay, you ready?
Yes, sir.
So route check, OFP number 3. We are going from Echo Golf Sierra Sierra to Echo India Delta Whiskey. Our flight call sign is Bravo Tango Romeo 001. Then I will go to route to look at the route, which is on page 2. So we are starting with the Ottawa 1 Romeo departure to Ottawa, Quebec 75 to Bossard, Tango 420 to Tango November Tango, Upper Lima 28 to Leldo, Mike 145 Bagso, and it's the Bagso 3 Lima arrival into runway 28 left in Dublin.
Good.
Then I'll go back to page number 1, and I will go up to the number 5 point there, and I'll say total distance 329.
Good. So what, as you can see, while Petter was reading that, I was cross-checking that everything matched perfectly. He said it's a distance of 329. I'm going to look here, and it says 334. 5 mile difference, slightly overshooting turns and stuff like that. That's very normal. So we're looking for like a gross error check. If this said 250, then we need to deep dive into where it's gone wrong. But as long as it's ballpark, 334, and I'll say, let me just actually, I'm just going to go in here. I'm just going to put 4,000 because it hadn't calculated. So I'm just going to go progress. It says here landing with 3.6 tons.
Okay, we have a alternate fuel of 2.2.
2.2. So that means we've got a good 1.4 tons of extra fuel on board, which we've taken today. So that gives us plenty of breathing room. If this was less than 2.2, again, we probably have to uplift fuel. Maybe we'd made a mistake. So it's another cross-check that we've taken the right amount of fuel. Yeah. So once we've cross-checked the distance and the arrival fuel, now we go back to your legs or your route page, and now and only now can we execute it. And when we execute it, that light goes out, and now everything goes magenta, which we'll show you in a minute. Okay, so let's come on. So that's the route check done. What I'm going to do now is my instrument cross-check, and we do this as pilot flying. And we start with the time, and we're just checking that our clocks are in agreement. So I've got 12:23 UTC, which the data comes from the GPS. Instrument cross-check, so I've got 1013 is the pressure setting today, giving me an altitude of 350 feet, and we cross that against all of the altimeters. The MFRA of 1348, which we got from our takeoff performance, which was correct. Flight directors are on, and mine is the master, and the standby instruments are set. So we're looking that we've got the compasses, the heading at the moment, just about 040, QNH is set. We do have these flags here, these little amber flags, but that's because we don't have a VOR that we're tracking, so that's normal. So it'd be 1224 UTC, 1013, giving me 350 feet, 1348 MFRA, flight directors are on, mine's the master, and the standby instruments are set. That's your instrument cross-check. Your briefing now. So I would say, okay, this is a 737-800, where it's a standard left-hand seat, flap 5 departure, off runway 22, and it's a noise abatement 2 today, which means we're going to be accelerating when we get to 1,348 feet. And noise abatement, there's different noise abatements, which we can go more into in the Q&A, but that will be specified by the airport, depending on what kind of noise sensitivity requirements they have. Depends on when we start, going from our climb configuration to leveling and accelerating. So yeah, standard left-hand seat, flat 5, runway 22, noise abatement 2 to 1,348 feet. And you can add anything else in there that might be relevant. Maybe we're using anti-ice, wet speeds, anything else you might find as appropriate to brief at that time. So route check, instrument check, briefing. Now we get to the E, which is the emergencies, which is where Petra and I would run through our actual actions that we would do if we have a problem when we start the takeoff roll. Now, the takeoff roll is broken into 2 or 3 main areas, depending on which way you look at it. We've got up to 80 knots, which we classify as low speed, above 80 knots, which is high speed, and then obviously beyond V1, which is where we're committed to getting airborne. So, Peter, up to 80 knots, we're relatively low energy, loads of runway left. If we have a problem, what's the general consensus?
So we basically stop for anything that feels suspicious and looks suspicious up to 80 knots, because it's not really dangerous. You have not much energy in you, so you're not going to be heating the brakes that much or anything. And B, you haven't been using up much runway because you haven't accelerated much. So you have loads of runway ahead of you. You can just gently stop the aircraft, taxi off, and deal with it without causing any safety concerns whatsoever. Yeah.
Exactly.
Above 80 knots, that's not really the case. Above 80 knots, you're starting to have eaten up more runway. You have much more energy. And that's why above 80 knots, we only stop for very particular things, which Ben is going to brief us very soon.
Yeah. So above 80 knots, as the energy in the aircraft is proportional to the square of your airspeed. So the more you go up, your energy in the aircraft is going up even more. So that's why the risks go up above 80. So I would start my emergency briefing. Okay, Peter, above 80 knots, I'll only reject 4: an engine fire, a fire warning, a failure, engine failure, predictive wind shear, or if I deem that the aircraft is unable or unsafe to fly. And that gives us a little bit of airmanship to decide whether it would be safe to fly or not. And then I'd say what I'm going to do if we do reject. So if I call stop, I'm going to simultaneously close the thrust levers. I'm going to disengage the auto throttle. I'm going to manually deploy the speed brake. I'm going to confirm max manual brakes or max RTO braking. I'm going to apply maximum reverse thrust. I'm going to bring the aircraft to a stop, and I'm going to set the parking brake.
Okay. If you call stop, I will first of all note the brakes on speed. I will call out any emissions. I will call out 100 knots, 80 knots, 60 knots, auto brake disarm. And once you have set the parking brake, I will select the flaps to 40, and then I will contact ATC and tell them we have rejected.
Yeah, and the reason we select flaps to 40 is simply because it makes the wings highly curved. So if whatever problem we've had results in an evacuation, those evacuating on the overwing exits, rather than having to jump off a wing, can effectively use the flaps to slide down. So we get the aircraft ready just in case. Okay, so at that point then, once we've stopped, I continue briefing now, and I would say, okay, at that point, we'll just slow everything down. We'll evaluate the situation. We'll carry out any drills as appropriate. And if we decide to evacuate, we will read and do the evacuation checklist, which will be on what we call the QRH, the Quick Reference Handbook, which normally lives down here. We'll then run the evacuation checks on the back of the QRH. We'll pull the cockpit voice recorder, so that stops it recording from then on, and it preserves it, so Petter can make a video later on. And you'll grab any any dangerous goods paperwork, and we'll also grab the passenger manifest so that the emergency services can do head counts later on. So we've talked about what we're going to do if we stop. Now I say, but if the callers keep going, there'll be no actions below 400 feet, apart from raising the landing gear with a positive radar climb and cancelling any warnings. Above 400 feet, once the aircraft's under control, we'll verify that we've got heading select, we'll state the malfunction, and we'll carry out any memory items as appropriate. Once we get to MFRA, minimum flap retraction altitude of 1348, I'm going to call bug up, which effectively moves our little magenta bug to where it says up on our airspeed tape. I'm going to call bug up. We're going to start retracting flaps on schedule. And once the flaps are up and there's no lights, we're going to engage level change, which is a pitch mode. We'll learn more about that later. And we're going to set max continuous thrust. And that, as we actually talked about this in the Q&A, takeoff thrust is limited to 5 minutes. So after 5 minutes, we've got to reduce it to maximum continuous thrust, which is normally a slightly lower thrust rating if we're going at high thrust takeoffs. So we're going to set max continuous thrust, and we'll climb out towards the minimum sector altitude, which in Stansted, 3,000 feet, is perfectly safe. We'll get the autopilot engaged. We'll maybe keep climbing, maybe start routing overhead the airfield, enter a hold, and then we'll run the checklist and make a plan and decide on the best course of action from there. So that's kind of a standard emergency brief. But anything you'd add into it from your side?
No. That's. I mean, you try to, as with every briefing, it's supposed to be brief. That's in the name of the world. So, you add in things that you think is appropriate, especially the first flight of the day, which is when we do this to make sure that both of us are kind of tuned into what could potentially happen. Yeah. But I wouldn't put too much into it, because at some point the other person is going to start zooming out. So.
Just switch off. Exactly. Because we, Petter and I, as instructors and examiners in the sim, we will be training and examining pilots every 6 months to do these rejected takeoffs or engine failures. But they might not have actually done one in the sim from 5 months ago. So it's important that we by briefing it, we're keeping the actions at the forefront of our brain, so that if it were to happen, we've already thought about it and kind of pre-armed it in our heads, if that makes sense. So it's really important that we do it, but keeping it brief. As we said. So we've done the route check, instrument cross-check, we've done the briefing, we've done the emergency, and now we can start talking about the taxi routing we expect. So now we bring our taxi chart up. And as you can see on there, there's a lovely picture of London Stansted. And you can see, if you have a little closer look, we're on stand 5-3 right, Charlie 5-3 right. So we'd identify where that is. And that's on kind of like the northerly finger, if you can see it on your screen there. And we go, okay, we're on 5-3 right. We both identify where we are. and we're going to talk about pushback. So, okay, we expect a pushback. As you can see on there, there's multiple taxi lines. We have what we call the Charlie West, Middle, and East line. You can get pushback onto either. Now, there's a threat here that I would normally identify, because as a 737, you could have aircraft pushing back on the opposite side of the apron to the west line, and we might be pushing back to the east line. And when we taxi out, we could be passing them. And our wings can get very, very close. However, as long as we are on the taxiway center line and the other aircraft is on the taxiway center line, we're not going to clip wings. We've got plenty of space. It looks horrible, Petter, doesn't it, when you're looking at the window?
It looks terrible, especially when you're meeting someone that's coming onto the apron and you're taxiing out. Like you really. The problem is when you're looking out, and this is something that people don't really realize, is that when you're sitting in the left seat and you're taxiing out and you're looking over to the left to see your wingtip to make sure it doesn't clip anyone, what actually happens is that as you're looking to the left, your nose blocks your right eye, right?
Yeah.
So you don't not notice that. No one ever notices that. But if you keep looking to the left, you're actually only seeing with your left eye. And obviously you need both eyes in order to judge depth, right? To get depth perception. So as you're looking over to your left now, unless you turn around in your chair and you look, you're not going to get that depth perception. So you won't really feel if you're going to clip the wings. You have to trust that, as long as the other guy is on the center line and you are on your center line, you're going to be fine, right? But you've seen it over and over and over again. You see people clipping light poles, clipping wings, clipping. A speciality is clipping the vertical and the horizontal stabilizer of another aircraft, and this is why it happens, especially at low visibility conditions.
I mean, if it's nighttime, it's chucking it down with rain. This window's got all rain on it. You can see the winglet. If you like, you can't see it from this view, but if you kind of really arch your neck, you can see the winglet, and all you can see is a little glow of the light on the wing, and I would almost say it's impossible to accurately judge, and that's where Petter said we've got to trust the taxiway lines. And I'll brief the FO and say, look, if you've got any doubt as to whether we're on it correctly or they're on it correctly, just let me know. Again, we'll stop, we'll set the parking brake, we'll tell ATC immediately, and hopefully everyone will stop, and we've prevented an incident from occurring.
Yeah, no, we can't overemphasize that enough. As in, like any, and this goes for both. If you're not sure if you have clearance, and if you're not sure where you are, whatever you feel, any of you feel that there's any kind of doubt building up, stop, ask for assistance. Because it's so much better to ask one time too many than one time too few. Like it really is, and I cannot overemphasize this enough.
Yeah, and I think aviation here is really the pointy edge of the spear, isn't it? It's really cutting edge in the sense that in the way that we manage human error. We are human, we make mistakes. No matter how big your ego might be, we all make mistakes. And I think aviation is good at realizing that, teaching it to pilots. And as a result, we've got these strategies in place that really encourage assertiveness, intervention, advocacy, that get people speaking up. And, if you're not sure, just stop. Err on the side of caution. And that's one of the things that makes aviation so safe, I think. And it's certainly something to take away from this. So, we get taxi push back onto the east line. We're going to taxi out then. We're going to go through the Charlie taxiway. And then we expect then to go almost a little S-turn, probably onto Sierra 1, or maybe the second exit there, which is Romeo 1. Or if it's really busy, we might go all the way further down the runway to Quebec. But again, we brief where we're expecting to go. We brief the threats. And, maybe it was low vis, we brief other things. But for today, it's lovely, it's quiet. That's probably as far as we would go. And I'd ask if there's any questions or anything that Petter would want to add to that briefing. Then that's the taxi. So we've done route check, instruments, briefing, emergency taxi. The very last thing now is to brief the SID, the standard instrument departure. And the standard instrument departure is a standard way of an aircraft getting airborne off a runway and joining the airway, which is effectively a motorway in the sky. And it does it in a very controlled, organized bit of airspace that air traffic control know what we're doing, we know what we're doing, and basically specifies tracks and distances and altitudes for us to fly in order to do that. And that's what a standard instrument, or a SID, standard instrument departure, does. So what we would do now is we would go back into the FMC, and actually before I do that, I'm going to bring up what you can do to help kind of visualize it. If on your EFIS control panel, you can see, because we're pointing the wrong way at the moment, you can't really see any of the route. So if you move your knob here to go from map to plan, we're in map at the moment, what it's going to do is put us in the middle here. and it will show you any little issues, which I can already see. And you can already expand your range a little bit. And if you look on your screen, you can already see big picture stuff that our magenta line, apart from this little break, which we will fix, looks very similar to what we're seeing on the chart. So straight away, big picture, we're looking good already. And what I'm going to do now is I would brief from the chart to the FMC. And that's an important thing to kind of get your head around, is that we brief from the chart to the FMC. Pedro, I'm sure you've seen it as well, where I've seen cadets give a lovely briefing, but making it fit, and at the very end realizing that actually they briefed the completely the wrong departure. It's something that does tend to happen.
Oh, absolutely. I've seen that. Normally they pick it up at some point because things start not to make sense. But I've known of people who were briefed not only the wrong SID but off the wrong runway.
Yeah, I've seen it as well. It's quite and deliberate. If I see them doing it, normally I'll leave them, because it's far better to let them make the mistake and then realize that it is for you to jump in, isn't it? And they'll be like horrified when they've gone, oh my goodness, I've really kind of just assumed all this is correct.
Yeah.
So we've got
the best learning experiences is definitely that. This is one of the keys of being a line training captain, something that takes a little while to learn. Yeah. Is that you have to make people make their mistakes and just leave them long enough for it to actually be a learning experience.
Yeah,
you can go in. I mean, both you and I, Ben, can go in, and we can spot them even before they make a mistake. We can spot the mistake happening and correct them. And in that case, they're just going to be led. They're like, okay, I'm just going to do it like that, and they will never remember it. But they will remember the one day that the line training captain just said, "So you briefed the wrong runway and the wrong SID." No, that is going to be like burned into the memory, and they will never do that again. So it's kind of like the finer points of things.
Yeah, it's a great way of letting them do it, and it's one of the Pedro said, a skill that will take a bit of time and a bit of confidence to build up as a line trainer, is knowing when to step in. But yeah, we will go through this now. So we're flying the Utava 1 Romeo, and we'll start off at the top. We make sure we've got the right chart. We can see on the chart we've got Utava 1 Romeo, and at the very top of the page where it says Jeppesen, underneath that we have a code, and each page has like a number and a letter. So we're on page 30-3M. 3 Mike, and it's effective the 7th of September last year. So we're both checking the charts. We're both checking we've got the right charts. They're not out of date. There's a few little notes at the top there. It says transition altitude is 6,000 feet. Now, remember we looked at that once before. So if you press init ref, if you're not sure enough. There we go. Yeah, Pedro knows what he's talking about. There we go. You can see transition altitude is 6,000 feet, which is when we transition from QNH to the standard pressure setting of 1013. And again, that's something we could maybe delve into in a Q&A. When instructed, contact stands to director or London control and report the call sign, your SID, and your current altitude on initial contacts. That's a very standard call. So it's just reminding you to do that. Talking about noise routes doesn't really affect us. Tells you about cruising levels, doesn't really affect us. And CPDLC we won't be using. Now, it says Utava 1 Romeo in bold below that departure, runway 22. So what I'm going to do now is I go on here, back to route now, because we're going to check it in our page. And I've got runway 22. And I'm going to check also that my heading that I have set is aligned with the runway we're departing from. And in Stansted, it's runway 22, and the heading is 222, which we would find from another chart. If we sometimes, especially going to Poland or places like that, that's quiet, you might land on one runway and depart on another. So you might still have the reciprocal runway set on here. So we just double check that. And then we go to page 2. Utava 1 Romeo. So that agrees with what we have here. Then in red, speed max 250 below flight level 100. So if you go to your climb page now, because that's part of your climb speed, you can see there's a speed restriction. Again, 250 knots below flight level 100. If it wasn't there, you could put it in yourself. You can literally just type in 250/100 and you can line select it there and it'll be ready to go. Unless otherwise instructed. Now there's a warning below that, and it's an important one. Due to interaction with other routes, do not climb above 4,000 feet until instructed by air traffic control, and no turns below 848 feet. So we'll go to our legs page, and you can see the very first waypoint in here. This is speed, and this column is altitude. And you can see the very first altitude in there. It says 850 feet. A. What's the A significance of the A, Petter?
At or above.
At or above. So in other words, the FMC won't guide us to turn until we're at or above 850 feet, which agrees with the chart here. Okay, so we've kind of covered the big picture, the notes and so on. And now what we're going to do is kind of start narrowing it down to more of the specifics of what we're actually going to fly. That's kind of how we visualize it with cadets. Big picture, notes, any MSA. For example, the MSA today, minimum sector altitude. If you look at your chart, it's broken down into quarters. And you can see there that in like an orangey color, you've got 2000 in the top in the northwest, 1800 in the northeast, 21 and 17 in that sector. And that gives you the minimum altitude within 25 miles that will give you at least 1,000 foot above any terrain or obstacles. So that's the minimum safe altitude, if you like, that you can fly to. So we briefed that. It's really good for the situation awareness. Sorry, Peter, were you going to say something?
No. I'm listening with awe.
So, and that's something we would relate to with like an engine problem. If we have any problems after takeoff, it's really important that you know what the minimum safe altitude to level off at is. So we might be in cloud, we can't see terrain. So we need to be, once we're above that altitude, we know we're safe. And in some airports like Turin, like in the northern Italy, in the foothills of the Alps, it could be like 17,000 feet in certain directions because there's mountains everywhere. So we brief that. Now, at the very bottom of the page, obviously we have the pictorial representation, but we have the routing. And we read this now. We're going to go from the chart. We're going to give you a little bit of logic here in the FMC on how this works. Now, on the left side of your route, this is your legs page. And on here, it gives you each individual waypoint. So the route page gives you airways and waypoints. But along the Quebec 75 airway, there's multiple waypoints. And if you want to see what they are, for example, we go to our legs page and it shows you each individual waypoint all the way along the routing. And the first waypoints are part of our SID. So if you look there, it reads, I say to Pat, okay, it says climb straight ahead to 3.1D ISX. Okay, that looks like gobbledygook. So we're going to climb straight ahead. And the runway track is 222. This says 223. We know that's straight ahead. And you can see on here, here's the runway. And sure enough, we're climbing straight ahead. So that looks good. 3.1 ISX. Peter, what's the significance of that?
3.1 ISX, that means 3.1 nautical miles away from the ISX localizer DME beacon. So we have to make sure that we have tuned the localizer DME frequency, which in this case is 110.5 India 0 X-ray.
As you can see on the chart there, the little arrow next to the airport, it says 110.5 ISX. And I've got it tuned here, 110.5, 110.5. And you can see, if you look at your PFD, when you've selected it, it idents it as the India Sierra X-ray. So that's the code for that waypoint. And we go to 3.1 miles. Now, it doesn't show 3.1 miles, but it does say Charlie.
Yeah.
Any clues as to what that means?
You're asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you.
Great. I love getting this.
If you like.
Putting it up on the penalty point. So if you look down on your alphanumerical table on your CDU, you can see that obviously you have A, B, C, D, E, F, G according to the alphabetic order. So instead of having to write out loads of numbers into the to these coded points, they've devised a little system. So if what I've said is like Alpha is 1, Bravo is 2 miles, Charlie is 3 miles, Delta is 4 miles, and so on. So that means that the 221 Charlie means that on the 221 track, more or less, at distance 3, this point is. Now, obviously it says 3.1 here. It probably is 3.1, but it's just to show us that, yes, they have taken the distance into account.
Correct, exactly. So whenever you see these letters here, we're going to reference those to the keypad and see what number that is. So, and it's a gross number, so 3.13. So it goes out to 3.1 miles. Then it says turn right, and you can sure enough see, it's going to go here, a right turn. Now there is a bit of a break here, and we're going to talk about why that is. So it says turn right to intercept the BKY. Now, the BKY is the code for a VOR, which is a ground-based navigation aid called Barkway. And you can see on the chart at Barkway at the top there, it says 11625 is the frequency. So we've got that on standby down here, ready to go should we need it. Now, and it says intercept 169 inbound, right turn. So there's a lot of information. It's a right turn, 169 inbound towards Barkway. So you can see here 169 inbound towards Barkway by DME 8. So I'm looking for a 169. And so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm looking for a hotel point. And sure enough, hotel point. Now, there's a break. Peter, why might there be a break here in this line? That doesn't help us.
No. So the FMC knows that in order to make that turn between two geographically defined points, the aircraft needs to fly at a certain speed, right? But it's stupid, the aircraft. So it will try to accelerate according to its normal climb standard unless we put a restriction in there. But there's no restriction in the SID per se. It's 250 knots below flight 100. So the aircraft says, all right, I'm going to go straight ahead 3.1, then I'm going to start accelerating, and I'm going to have this particular speed when we make the turn. But it can't make that turn with that speed because it's too fast. So what we can do is we can reduce that speed, which we tend to do, to 220 knots maximum for the first turn. That's a good general rule to have because it will make all of the initial turns tight. And if we do that, by line selecting it over, it will recalculate, and hopefully at some point we will see that it works better. At least in real aircraft it will.
It does, yes. Sometimes I've noticed in this we have to bring it down quite low. So I might bring it down something like silly 185, which we wouldn't actually do in real life. It's just the way that it works on here. So you put 185 slash because it's that side. There you go. Now you can see it's kind of joined it up on there. But as Petter said, in real life, generally 200, 220 works really well. All right, so we've done that by D8 Barkway. Then it says cross D5 Barkway at or above 3,000 feet. D5 is echo point, 3,000 or above. And then max 4,000, it says to D2 Barkway. So I'm looking for a 1, 2. I'm looking for a Bravo point. So we're continuing on this track. Bravo. Then it says turn left, intercept Barkway 262 to Yatava. So on here, it's actually got a 334. Now that's not, if I'm honest, that's slightly different to what you get in real life. And that's simply because it's overshooting it again. If I bring that speed back again, that will tighten that up. So if I put 220 at Yatava, there you go. So 2 says 258, which is near enough to Yatava. And I'd ask Petter now, what do you think the stop altitude, what's the maximum altitude we can climb to on this departure?
So I would look down then on my chart, and I will have a look at, in this case, the blue numbers on the chart. And what I'm looking for is at basically altitudes that have a line not only below it, but also above it, right? Because if you have an altitude that has a line below it, it means it's an at or above altitude. But I want to know where to stop. So in this case, I look at an altitude that has a line both below and above, saying that you need to maintain this altitude. And in this case, it looks like 4,000. Yeah.
And I would say, yeah, I agree, 4,000. So we'd set 4,000 here, and we check it. It is a hard altitude. It doesn't say above. And we've got 4.1 up here until we get our clearance, which we're about to get. And that's basically a SID briefing. Again, we might bring any threats in there if there's multiple stop altitudes, if it's busy airspace, if there's terrain, weather.
Exactly. In this case, obviously, we know that the reason that it's really, really tight, the airspace here, is because we have Luton just next door, and we have several arrivals coming in through Barkway, and they're going to be leveling off 1,000 feet above 4,000. They're going to have 5,000 feet. So one thing that I would note in this departure is to try to make sure that once we have the flaps up, no light, we can start reducing the climb rate so we don't climbing like a bat out of hell, because that can actually trigger TCAS warnings, both for ourselves and for incoming aircraft above us. Yeah. So those are kind of things that I would definitely talk to a cadet about.
Yeah, I've had that quite a few times. Coming into Stansted, when you're coming into land, you're actually normally vectored downwind here over the top of this departure. And the amount of times I've been flying over here and I've got a traffic, and there's an aircraft hooning out Stansted. There's nothing we can do because we're kind of level or descending, but you can see them then reducing their rate of climb to try and get rid of that and prevent any further warnings. But yeah, so that's something we'll be talking about more tomorrow as well. So we get the clearance now. So Petter, should we call for the clearance?
Absolutely. So I will make sure that I find the clearance delivery frequency then on our.
Yeah, which let me have a look on here. Clearance delivery. Off the top of my head, I'll put 12195. I'll put it on here. 12195. There we go. That's active. Shall I call or show you, sir?
Well, me being in the right seat, I would probably do it.
You go for it. Yeah.
So center delivery, butter 001. We are at stand, where are we?
5-3 right.
5-3 right, information Quebec, request clearance towards Dublin.
And it'll be Butter 01. Good afternoon. You're cleared to Dublin on the Utava 1 Romeo, squawk 2272.
Okay, clearance to Dublin, Utava 1 Romeo, squawk 2272, Butter 001.
Butter 01, read back correct. So good. So once we've got that, we go, yeah, Utava 1 Romeo, we've got it in the box. Stop altitude, we've confirmed. We have the clearance. We now set the stop altitude together. And then we would set the squawk in here of 22, if I can get it on here, if that works. 2272, but we're still on off at the moment, and that's the squawk. Now we're in a position where we're ready. We're kind of getting ready now, getting very close to departure, and we're going to do the safety inspection before start checklist. And the way we'll do this in real life is Petter would read the challenge, the left side of the checklist you can see on the screen, and I would check it and then call the response while Petter also looks at what I'm calling. When we're doing the single pilot, you can obviously read and do it. Okay, so you've got it in your workbook there. So if you haven't got the work, please do register via the 737 virtual737course.com, and you'll get access to the workbooks, etc. So Petter, are you happy to read these for me?
Absolutely. You ready?
Yeah, you go for it.
So flight deck safety inspection. Surfaces and shocks.
Checked.
Maintenance status.
That was in the tech log. We've checked.
Battery.
On.
Electric hydraulic pumps.
They're now on.
Landing gear lever.
Down.
Chips library.
We checked yesterday.
Perfect. With the flight deck safety inspection checks complete.
Good. Then we go over the page to the next part of the checklist.
Okay.
And
before start checklist.
Yes, please.
IRS mode selectors.
Okay, so they are nav.
The gear pins.
I just showed we checked them yesterday, but they are 1, 2, 3 removed.
Light test.
It was checked.
The oxygen.
Tested 100%.
Yaw damper.
Is on.
Nav transfer and display switches.
These are all in the normal and auto position.
Fuel.
So on the flight plan, we needed 5198, so 5.2 tons required. We've got 6 tons on board, and we've got 4 pumps on.
Perfect. Cab utility IFE galley power.
On.
The emergency exit lights.
Armed.
Fasten belts.
On.
Window heat.
On.
Air condition and pressurization.
So we've got PAX auto, bleeds on, and set.
Should we start the APU?
Yeah, good idea. We'll start that now. There we go.
Because here's a good pointer. If you come to this and you haven't started the APU, obviously we're going to need APU bleed to start the engines later on. We tend to start the APU when we get the load sheet. So when we get the final load information from the dispatcher, not before that.
No, so I'm just gonna close the doors here. There we go, just to make sure all the doors are closed. This is just a sim thing that should all start happening. Yeah. So
you'll notice as well, if this was in real life and you were looking at us from behind, I would call out the challenge. I would listen to what Ben responds, and I would look at what the actual switch position is. So it's a read, look, listen, like read, listen, look, all the way. Because it's so easy when you get used to these checklists. It's so easy to start rhyming them, which is just reading and then responding what it's supposed to be rather than what it is. And this is the last kind of point that we have, or last chance for some of these systems to pick up that we haven't done it properly. So you cannot be under stress when you do this. No matter how many slot times you have, holdover times, whatever it is, checklist discipline is crucial.
Yeah, and it's something we really, really drum into cadets. And yeah, they think it's good if they can do this super quickly, that it shows confidence. And it's obviously the complete opposite. We've got to slow it down to make sure we're covering everything.
Yeah, so that's the APU available. We can put that on the bus, and then we will start the clock for 1 minute, because it takes at least 1 minute before we're allowed to use it as a bleed source. And with all this chatting that we've done, it's already been 1 minute, so you can switch the APU on.
So I'll put that on, and we're going to get a master caution when we do that, because we have a dual bleed, which means there's potential back pressure, but that's normal with the engine shut down. We're just going to cancel that.
Yeah, it's just yet another sign that the 737 was built in the 60s.
Yeah.
So let's do that again then. So air condition and pressurization.
PAX auto, bleeds on, set.
Perfect. The pressurization mode selector
is in auto.
Instruments.
We've cross-checked.
Auto brake.
Is in RTO, rejected takeoff.
Hydraulics.
So we come down here and we're checking for minimum, we're looking for 3,000 PSI, minimum of 2,800. So hydraulics are normal.
Thank you. Speed brake.
Is down D10, and we're just going to do a final config check just to make sure that actually that's working again. So speed brake's down D10.
Perfect. Parking brake.
Set.
Stab train cutout switches.
Normal.
Wheel well 5 warning.
Was checked.
Radios, radar, and transponder.
So they are set and standby.
Rudder and lane trims.
3 and 0.
Takeoff briefing.
We've discussed.
PA.
Is complete.
Come on, do one.
Should we do a PA? But they'll want to hear your voice, Petter. Go on, give them your best PA.
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, very welcome on board this flight who's going to take you over towards Dublin this evening. Flight out today is expected to be in the region of 45 minutes. Flight conditions en route is expected to be fine with the weather in Dublin. Slightly rainy and gusty as it's typical for this time of the year. We will be cruising at an altitude of approximately 36,000 feet. And right now, I would just like you to please sit back, relax, and give your utmost attention to my cabin crew as they demonstrate the safety equipment aboard. Remember that they do this for the safety of you and the safety of everyone seated all around you, so please listen carefully. My colleague Ben is going to fly us over today, so he will be back with more information about the arrival time and weather later on. But for now, sit back and relax.
Beautiful. Beautifully done. Beautifully done. So PA is complete. Big round.
FMC CDU.
So the FMC CDU, so what you're looking for here, guys, is to make sure that you as pilot flying have your takeoff page and the pilot monitoring has the legs page for any route adjustments once we get airborne. So takeoff and legs. So FMC CDU is set.
N1 IS bugs.
N1 and SB bugs. So we're looking here to make sure that this are set in auto. Can you see they're both in auto? So we've got auto and we've got 86.8 with a 136, 137, 140, which we've got set now. And we've got a green on here as well.
Good. Stabilizer trim?
Is, again, we reference the FMC. If I can zoom in. So 5.79 units set.
The performance, weight and balance.
Is signed and sent.
EFB.
Is nicely airplane mode and stowed.
Thank you. Flight deck windows, cockpit door.
They are locked.
Doors.
All the lights are out now. Doors are closed.
And holding on passengers. And we're waiting for the cabin crew to give it a cabin crew.
Yep. So once the cabin crew, everyone's sat down and ready to go, they'll let us know the cabin is secure. And all we do is there's an intermediate position. We just put this no smoking sign to the middle position to say the cabin is secure for push. Cabin is secure.
Passengers
are seated.
Before start, checklist complete down to the line. Now, I had some questions that I can just take right now.
Yeah.
So if you look at the checklist there are some asterisks that people are asking about. Those asterisks, Navin, if you can put the checklist back on. There we go. Those asterisks in the before the checklist points, they are used for through flights, which means for turnaround flights only. So the full checklist is done on the first flight of the day for each crew, and the one on the subsequent flights, we only go through the ones that have an asterisk next to them.
Yeah. It's a really good point. And actually, it's something we do in a bit more detailed transit turnarounds in the future for those of you that are interested as well. So something to look forward to there. But now we're in a position where we are ready to speak to the ground crew. They've been patiently waiting out there for us. I can see the dispatcher waiting to go. They're ready. We would speak to them, and we would now start getting ready to push back and start engines. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we're going to be doing tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're finally going to get airborne. We're going to be pushing back. We're going to be talking through engine starts. We're going to be talking through flows, taxi out procedures, runway lineup procedures, the takeoff itself, what we're looking for, what we do, and actually get us airborne. So we've got that to look forward to tomorrow. Same time tomorrow, 1700 UTC. Again, all of these will be recorded and available for you to watch back inside the private Facebook when you get a chance. Thanks again, guys, for all the great questions. We have captured them. We will capture them. I'll be live tomorrow at 1300 UTC for the Q&A session. We can deep dive, get nerdy. I'm sure Petter's nerd bell will be going off without him even realizing. And then tomorrow, same time again tomorrow for the next element of this journey. But Petter, amazing. Great job.
Awesome. Yeah. Very good. Very. This is always interesting, and for me as well, as I'm not flying so much at the moment, it's good to get a little bit of a refresher. So I'm really enjoying this.
It's great fun. It's good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Have a brilliant evening. Have a great day tomorrow, and I'll see you on the next one. Have a good night now. Take care.
Good night.